This is lesson 14, part 1. We're going to start covering time signatures. In everyday life, we measure time in hours, minutes, and seconds, and in music, we measure duration or time in beats and subdivisions of those beats. Beat is a recurring pulse. It is very much like a second hand on a clock in that it is very predictable and it is independent of anything else going on around it. Remember that composers always group beats into recurring patterns, and we're always going to emphasize that first beat or downbeat of each group of beats. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if they're grouped into threes, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, if they're grouped into twos. Remember that while beat isn't something we can actually see on a score, we do see rhythm on the score. So rhythm is represented by the note values and by the rests that we see on a score. The note values will tell us when to start and stop certain pitches or sounds, and the rests will be used to tell us when to start and stop silences. Metronomes, of course, are very useful tools to us as musicians, and they can help us learn to internalize an external beat. Metronomes measure beats per minute.
This is the staff, comprised of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines that we count from the bottom to the top, and 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. Remember that this is the treble or G clef, starting on line 2, bumping up to line 3, down to line 1, up and around. And it's called the G clef because this curly Q action around line 2 helps us to know or identify that if we were to put a note head right there on line 2, this would be a G. From there, we'll be able to decode the other pitches on the staff, and we will learn much more about this soon, but for now, we're just identifying the symbols. This is the bass, or G clef, starting on line 4, bumping up to 5, half a heart down and stopping just under line 2, a dot in space 4, a dot in space 3. These dots help us know that line 4 is really important because if we were to put a note head there, it would be an F, a specific F. It's a pretty low pitch. And from there, we'll be able to decode all these other pitches. Again, we'll cover this in much more detail when we get to the actual unit on pitch. We learned about bar lines or measure lines, which go from the top to the bottom of the staff. And each these spaces between bar lines is called a bar or a measure. And we can number those bars or measures, 1, 2, 3, 4. This will make it easier for us to find where we are in the music. We have learned that composers will always group beats into recurring patterns, and that first beat of each group will be emphasized. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And as it turns out, the bar or measure lines are actually going to be used to separate those groupings. So if the composer decides there should be 4 beats in each measure, or the beats should be grouped into 4s, we'll always see a total of 4 beats between each of these sets of measure lines. So there'll be 4 beats in every single measure. It could be that there's only 1 note value in this measure, but as long as it adds up to 4 beats, we're good. There could be 9 notes in this measure, but as long as it adds up to 4 beats, we're good. So these bar lines will serve to separate those groups of beats.
So I introduced the Gordon rhythm syllables as a way of being able to speak rhythm while we keep a beat in our hands. So remember that a 1-beat note will just be represented with do. That's what we'll say. A 2-beat note will be do, ooh. We're going to add today, of course, that a 3-beat note will be do, ooh, ooh. And we're going to add that a half-beat note, we're going to put 2 of them together right away, so that half plus a half equals 1. And we're going to say do day. So notice we still put the do right on the beat, but we're going to split that beat in half by going do day, do day, do day, do day. We'll try some examples. For our first example, I'm going to set the metronome at 120, so 120 beats per minute, twice as fast as the second hand if you're doing the math on a clock. And we're grouping the beat into fours. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So first of all, we're just going to put that beat in our hands. 1, 2, ready, go. We're going to say 8 one-beat notes. 1, 2, ready, go. Do, 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 do. One more time. 1, 2, ready, go. Do, 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 do. For this next example, I'm going to set the metronome at 100, and we're going to group the beats into threes. 1, 2, 3, 1, ready, clap. Here's the beat. We're going to say 4 3-beat notes. 1, ready, go. Do, ooh, ooh, do, ooh, ooh, do, ooh, ooh, do, ooh. I'm going to say that again. 1, ready, go. Do, 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 do. So for rest, we're just not going to say anything. Remember that the beat continues, the pulse continues, no matter what is going on around it. It is independent of the rhythm. So whether we are saying a note or saying a rest or silence, our pulse will continue. We're setting the metronome at 80, and we're grouping beats into fours. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, ready, clap. And what we're going to do is we're going to say a 1-beat note and rest for 1 beat. And we're going to do that 4 times. 1, 2, ready, go. Do, 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 do. Let me do that again. 1, 2, ready, go. Do, 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 do. We're going to use half-beat notes in our next example. So remember, we're going to take 2 of those half-beat notes. We're going to put them together, and we're going to use the syllables do, day. So do will still be what we use when we say the beat, but we'll now evenly split up that beat into 2 parts and use day for the second half of that. So do, day, do, day, do, day, do, day. We're going to get the beat going at 70. And this is grouped into fours. So 1, 2, ready, clap. And we're going to say 4 pairs of half-beat notes. So 8 notes total. 1, 2, ready, go. Do, day, do, day, do, day, do, day. Do that again. 1, 2, ready, go. Do, day, do, day, do, day, do, day. So in many of the past lessons, I've alluded to the idea that a composer will provide us with additional decoding information on the staff that will assign a specific note or rest value as the beat or pulse note. From there, we're going to be able to assign specific beat values, durations, to each of the note and rest values we've learned about. We've also talked about the concept of beats being grouped into recurring patterns. So today we're going to be learning about time signatures, and time signatures are this bit of decoding information we've been waiting for. So they're going to do 2 things. They're going to provide us with the information we need to know which note is going to be assigned the position of beat or pulse note, and it's also going to give us the information that will enable us to know how we should group the beats together.
We're on Unit 2, which is our rhythm unit, Lesson 6, time signature. How do music readers know how many beats there are in a measure? Or another way of saying this would be how to group the beats. Should we group them in 2s or 3s or 4s? They know because at the beginning of a piece of music, to the right of the clef sign, there are 2 numbers, one above the other, like this. Note this is not a fraction. These 2 numbers are called a time signature. So this is a time signature, as is this, and as is this. It's also called a meter signature, but we'll call it a time signature. All right, so the top number of the time signature tells us how many beats there are in each measure. Okay, so another way of saying this would be how we're supposed to group the beats together. Are we supposed to group them in 2s, 3s, 4s, 6s, whatever the composer decides? So this top number tells us that we should be grouping the beats together so that there are 4 beats in each measure. Remember, the measure lines will be used to divide those groupings. So this time signature would tell us that 3 beats should be in each measure. This tells us that there should be 6 beats in each measure. They should be grouped in 6s. It doesn't tell us how many note values, it just tells us how many beats. All right, so the bottom number of the time signature tells us which note gets 1 beat. This is what we've been waiting for, the pulse or the beat note. Once that's assigned, we can figure out the specific beat duration of each of the note arrest values that we've learned about so far. So what I do tell students in this case is that when you're looking at the bottom number of the time signature to know the assignment of the pulse or beat note, think of it as the denominator of a fraction. So, for example, if you see a 4 as the bottom number of a time signature, think of it as the denominator of a fraction, and you'll be led to the right answer, which is that this means that a quarter note should be 1 beat, okay, or is 1 beat, is a better way of saying that. This also means that a quarter note equals 1 beat, okay? If you see an 8, think of it again as the denominator of a fraction. What would you call that? An 1/8. So an 1/8 note equals 1 beat. So just as I mentioned that a clef is going to give us decoding information, right? It's sort of, there's almost a code embedded in it that this is a G clef because that's, it's highlighting the G line, or this is an F clef because it's highlighting the F line. So in a similar way, these time signatures really are like a code. And if you can crack the code, if you understand what it means, you have all the decoding information you need. So he says, here's how to know which note gets 1 beat. If the bottom number is a 2, again, I'll say think of it as the denominator of a fraction. A half note gets a beat, right? So if you see a 2 on the bottom of the time signature, you're going to think half note equals a beat. If the bottom number is a 4, again, think of the denominator of a fraction. You think quarter when you see that, and that's exactly right. A quarter note gets 1 beat. If the bottom number is an 8, denominator of a fraction, you think 1/8 when you see that. An 1/8 note gets 1 beat. Okay, so just working through these last examples together, we're looking at this time signature right here. This time signature is 4/4, and that is how we read it. We say 4/4 time, or just 4/4. There are 4 beats in a measure then, because the top number tells us how many beats there are in each measure. 4 beats per measure, and the bottom number tells us what kind of note gets a beat, what kind of note value. So we know, again, think of this as the denominator of a fraction. So this means that a quarter note equals 1 beat. So there will be 4 beats in each measure, and a quarter note gets 1 beat. This time signature, again, we look at the top number tells us how many beats in a measure. So there are 3 beats per measure. The bottom number tells us what kind of note gets a beat, so we think of it as a denominator of a fraction. In this case, it's going to be that an 1/8 note equals 1 beat. In this time signature, we see that there are going to be 2 beats per measure. And again, the bottom number tells us which kind of note gets a beat, so we think of it as the denominator of a fraction, and then we know that a half note is going to be equal to 1 beat.